Do you really think you can judge me? Avery Westbrook's voice echoed in the courtroom, sharp and mocking. Her laughter reverberated off the high ceilings like a cruel melody, sending an uncomfortable chill through the air. She stood at the defendant's table, her chin raised high, as if she were untouchable. The judge slammed his gavel down with authority, but Avery only smirked, her gaze unwavering. The room fell silent as everyone, jury, audience, even the lawyers, watched her, stunned. Avery was different from the usual defendant. She didn't tremble, didn't show fear, not even the slightest hint of worry. She was a woman who had always believed the world owed her something. "I don't care what you decide," Avery sneered. "This whole trial is a joke. You think you're punishing me? Well, I'll walk out of here just like I always do. You'll see." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even the prosecutor, Marcus Calloway, froze, his fingers gripping the pen so tightly his knuckles turned white. The elderly judge, a man with sharp, wise eyes, leaned forward, his voice stern. "Miss Westbrook," he said, "I suggest you conduct yourself with dignity. This is a court of law." Avery laughed louder, almost to the point of mockery. "Oh, I know exactly what this is," she said, "and I know exactly how it's going to end." She tilted her head slightly, her dark brown curls bouncing with the motion. She was winning, or so she thought. But Avery was wrong. Before we continue with her trial, let's take a step back and look at where this all began. Because nothing in Avery Westbrook's life had been ordinary. She didn't come from money, but she managed to claw her way into the elite circles of society. Her path was paved with broken relationships, ruined reputations, and unpaid debts. At 33, Avery was a stunning woman, with piercing blue eyes and an air of self-assuredness that could disarm anyone. But beneath that confident exterior lay a ruthless manipulator who had destroyed everyone who dared to trust her. She was clever, perhaps too clever for her own good. Avery had a talent for twisting words and making people second-guess their own memories. And now she was here, in a courtroom, accused of the very crimes she had committed so many times before. Fraud, embezzlement, identity theft. She had stolen from business partners, friends, and even charitable organizations. The money she had funneled into her lavish lifestyle, designer clothes, luxury vacations, a penthouse apartment in the heart of Manhattan, was all blood money. Yet Avery felt no guilt, no remorse. "If people are dumb enough to trust me, that's their problem," she had once said to her ex-business partner, Sarah Morrison. Sarah had lost everything, her business, her savings, because of Avery's lies. When Sarah had asked her, tears streaming down her face, if she even felt bad for what she had done, Avery had just shrugged. "Business is business, Sarah," she had said with a cold smile. "You should have been smarter." Sarah had stared at her, broken. "You're heartless," she had whispered. Avery had laughed and walked away. Months later, Sarah was sitting in the courtroom, watching her former partner face justice. But Avery wasn't worried. She had been in this situation before. She had found a way out each time. And this time, things would be no different. The trial had been dragging on for weeks. Marcus Calloway, the prosecutor, had done an excellent job laying out the evidence. Bank records, fake contracts, victim testimonies. It was all there. But Avery, as usual, was playing the system. She knew how to look innocent, how to shed just the right number of tears, how to play the victim. "I never meant to hurt anyone," she had said on the stand, her voice soft, her hand delicately dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "I just trusted the wrong people, and I got caught up in a bad situation. I was just trying to survive." Some jurors had looked at her with sympathy, while others had been skeptical. But Avery felt confident. She had been in this position before, and she knew how to win. After all, she always found a way to escape. But there was one thing Avery hadn't accounted for. One thing that would change everything. It started as a whisper, a murmur through the courtroom. Avery didn't hear it at first, but then she noticed the sudden shift in the air. The judge's eyes widened, and Marcus Calloway's face drained of color. Avery turned her head, confused. What was happening? The courtroom began to buzz with activity. People were shifting in their seats. Some gasped, others whispered. Avery felt a knot form in her stomach. For the first time, her confidence faltered. She glanced around the room, her pulse quickening. "What is going on?" she demanded, but her voice lacked the usual force it carried. There was no answer. The whispers grew louder, almost like a rising tide. Avery's heart pounded in her chest. She spun around, half expecting the judge or Marcus to react, but they were frozen, staring at something behind her. Confused, she turned her head to see what had everyone so rattled. Then she heard it. A soft, eerie chuckle. Not from her, but from somewhere else in the room. "What is this?" Avery stammered, her voice shaking. "What's happening?" No one answered. The whispers intensified, and then, suddenly, one word broke through the sea of murmurs. "Karma." A chill ran down Avery's spine. 3 months earlier, Avery had been at the peak of her success. She had just pulled off another brilliant con, this time involving a wealthy investor named Robert Langley. He was in his late 50s, a self-made millionaire who had built his business from the ground up. A kind-hearted man, Robert had spent much of his life donating to charities and mentoring young entrepreneurs. He was the perfect target for someone like Avery. She had played her role perfectly. Avery had spun a story of a struggling businesswoman with a revolutionary startup, desperate for investment. She crafted fake documents, forged contracts, and even had fabricated numbers showing her company on the brink of success. Robert, cautious at first, had been swept away by Avery's charm. She told him how she had been abandoned by her parents, how she had struggled to survive in a world that had never given her a chance. All of it was a lie, but Robert had believed her, as Avery had known he would. After months of manipulation, she had convinced Robert to invest nearly $2 million into her company. But as always, once the money was in her hands, she disappeared without a trace. Robert never saw a dime of his investment. Avery, on the other hand, spent the money on luxury vacations, designer jewelry, and a new penthouse apartment in the heart of Manhattan. She didn't feel an ounce of guilt. "If people are foolish enough to trust me, that's their problem," Avery had always told herself. But Robert Langley wasn't a fool. He wasn't just going to let her walk away this time. Avery had no idea how much Robert had lost because of her. His business collapsed under the weight of her betrayal. The investors pulled out. The banks refused to lend him money. And for the first time in his life, Robert was helpless. His home was foreclosed, his savings were gone, and his reputation was shattered. He was a man at rock bottom. Yet, despite his suffering, Robert wasn't angry. He was determined. Sitting in a small apartment, trying to figure out how to pick up the pieces, Robert received an unexpected letter. There was no return address, just a single envelope slipped under his door. Inside was a USB drive. His hands trembled as he plugged it into his laptop. The file was a video of Avery, caught on a hidden camera, bragging about her scams. The video showed her laughing as she described how easy it had been to manipulate Robert. "I can't believe how easy it was," her voice rang out, clear as day. He practically handed me the money. These people never learn. The camera had captured her smirking, swirling a glass of wine, mocking her victims. They always cry about it afterward, she continued, rolling her eyes. Like it's my fault they're idiots. I mean, come on. If you believe a story from someone like me, you deserve to lose your money. As Robert watched, his heart sank. This was his chance. This was the evidence he had been looking for. He knew he had to do something. Avery Westbrook thought she was untouchable, but he would make sure she wasn't. Back in the courtroom, Avery's confident smirk had vanished. She had been so sure of herself. The video was the last thing she had expected. For a moment, she didn't know how to react. She turned to her lawyer, her breath quickening. "Turn it off," she demanded, her voice shaking. "Turn it off now." But no one moved. The courtroom was frozen in a horrified silence as the video continued to play, showing Avery at her most arrogant and cold-hearted. There was no escape from it now. The lies, the manipulations, all of it was exposed for everyone to see. Avery's lawyer looked just as stunned as everyone else. The judge, too, seemed speechless, staring at the screen as the video played out its damning evidence. And then, as if the universe itself had been waiting for this exact moment, Avery's worst nightmare unfolded. She hadn't anticipated this. She had always been the one in control, the one pulling the strings. But now, for the first time in her life, she felt like the walls were closing in on her. The sound of a door opening broke the silence, and everyone turned in shock. In walked Robert Langley, the man she had swindled, the man who had believed in her only to be destroyed by her lies. His entrance was like a thunderclap in the courtroom. The gasps of surprise echoed through the room as Robert made his way to the front. He wasn't alone. Behind him, one by one, the people Avery had destroyed followed. There was Sarah Morrison, her former business partner, still bearing the scars of their ruined relationship. There was David Harper, a single father who had trusted Avery with his life savings, only to see it stolen for a supposed safe investment. And there was Jason Calloway, the director of a charity Avery had siphoned money from for her own luxury vacations. Avery's heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't expected them. She had done everything in her power to keep them in the dark, to keep them from ever finding out about the trial. Yet here they were, standing in front of her, their eyes burning with the determination Avery had never seen before. "How did you all know?" Avery asked, her voice trembling. "How did you find out?" But none of them answered. Instead, they simply watched as Robert stepped forward, his face set with a grim resolve. "I have something that changes everything," Robert said, his voice steady. "And it's time everyone here knows the truth about who Avery Westbrook really is." Avery felt like the ground was slipping beneath her feet. Her usual confidence, her ability to control any situation, was slipping away as Robert Langley and the others spoke. But what terrified her most wasn't the evidence. It wasn't the faces of her victims. It was the unexpected twist that was about to unfold. Robert stepped forward, his voice commanding as he addressed the judge. "Your Honor, I know I was not called as a witness today, but I have something crucial to add." He raised his hand, holding up a USB drive, the same drive that had exposed Avery's lies. "This is the video that proves everything." Avery's heart skipped a beat. The video was already being played, yet here was another version, another copy in Robert's hand. The proof was irrefutable. "Your Honor," Robert continued, "this is only part of the truth. The rest of it, everything Avery has done to us, to the people in this room, is something we need to confront. It's time that everyone knows the real Avery Westbrook." The room was tense with anticipation. Avery's breathing grew shallow as she stood there, helpless. She had spent years manipulating people, convincing them she was someone they could trust. But in that moment, the tables had turned. The judge nodded slowly, his eyes sharp as he turned to the group of people behind Robert. "If any of you wish to speak, please do so now," he said, his voice firm. One by one, the victims stepped forward, each sharing their own story of how Avery had destroyed their lives. Sarah Morrison, the former business partner, spoke of the betrayal that had wiped out her savings and forced her to rebuild from nothing. David Harper, the single father, told the court how Avery had convinced him to invest everything he had, only to see it disappear without a trace. And then there was Jason Calloway, the charity director, who had trusted Avery with funds meant for children in need, only to learn later that she had pocketed it all for herself. Avery stood there, her hands shaking at her sides. She wanted to speak, to deny everything, but the words wouldn't come. How could she argue against the truth? Each testimony was like a hammer striking her, breaking her down piece by piece. But just as the weight of her mistakes was starting to sink in, there was another twist, one she hadn't seen coming. The doors to the courtroom swung open, and in walked someone Avery had never expected to see again. Emily, her younger sister, the one Avery had left behind all those years ago, stood at the doorway. Avery's heart raced. The last time she had seen Emily was years ago, after she had stolen from her. The day Emily had needed help the most, and Avery had abandoned her. Back then, Emily had been nothing more than a weak, naive girl in Avery's eyes. Now, Emily was here, staring at her with a look Avery couldn't quite decipher. "You—" Avery's voice cracked, her breath catching in her throat. "What are you doing here?" Emily didn't speak right away. She just walked forward, her eyes never leaving Avery's. The room fell into a tense silence as she took a seat in the front row. Emily's presence was enough to make Avery's insides churn. "How did you know about this trial?" Avery asked, her voice low, almost desperate. She had gone to great lengths to keep her victims in the dark about her court case, paying off people, bribing sources to mislead them about the dates and details. But Emily was here. How? "I know everything, Avery," Emily said finally, her voice calm but filled with quiet authority. "And I've been waiting for this moment, for you to face the consequences of your actions." Avery's world tilted. Emily had never been involved in any of her schemes, never part of her con games. She had always thought Emily was too weak, too good, to ever be part of her world. But now, standing in front of her, Emily wasn't the same person she remembered. She was strong, and she was no longer intimidated by Avery. Avery's breath caught in her throat. She had never understood the depth of the hurt she had caused. She had always seen herself as the one in control, the one who could walk away without consequences. But now, as Emily stared at her with those cold, piercing eyes, Avery realized just how much she had lost. Her arrogance, her sense of invincibility, it was all gone. In its place was fear. Real, raw fear. The judge turned his gaze to Emily, who sat in the front row, her eyes never leaving Avery. "Miss Westbrook," he said, his voice stern, "it seems you have more to answer for than I initially thought. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" But Avery couldn't speak. The words were stuck in her throat. She had spent her life lying, manipulating, and deceiving everyone around her. But now, in this moment, she couldn't lie anymore. For the first time in her life, Avery Westbrook had no defense. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence after Emily's words. Avery's mind raced as she stood there, frozen, unable to respond. It wasn't just the weight of the video that had exposed her. It was Emily, her sister, the one person she had hurt the most. Avery had built her entire life on lies, deception, and manipulation. She had controlled everything, until now. The power, the confidence she had once wielded so effortlessly, was slipping away like sand through her fingers. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. Marcus Calloway, the prosecutor, stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "Your Honor, we've presented the evidence, and the video confirms what we've all known for years. Avery Westbrook is not a victim, but a predator. She's destroyed countless lives, including the one person who trusted her the most, her own sister." The words hit Avery like a slap to the face. Her gaze snapped to Emily, who was still sitting there, her expression unreadable. Avery had always been the one who controlled the narrative. She had manipulated people with a flick of her smile, twisted their emotions, and convinced them that they needed her. But Emily had never been fooled. Avery's stomach churned. She had always viewed Emily as weak, someone she could easily leave behind when it suited her. But now, Emily was the one standing tall, and Avery was the one trembling in front of the judge. "Miss Westbrook," the judge said, his voice cold, "you've been given every opportunity to explain yourself, to provide a defense. But as of now, the evidence is clear. I ask you again, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Avery opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She had no excuses left, no clever lies to tell. She could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her, every juror, every victim she had wronged, even her lawyer, who was now staring at her in disbelief. This wasn't just another game. This wasn't a situation she could talk her way out of. For the first time in her life, she was facing the consequences of her actions. The silence stretched on, unbearable and thick. Finally, Avery let out a shaky breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she said, her eyes scanning the room. I never meant to hurt anyone." The words were hollow. She knew it, and so did everyone else. Her attempt to feign remorse fell flat, like an actor who had forgotten her lines. No one in that courtroom was buying it. Then the judge spoke again, his tone resolute. "The court has heard enough. We will now proceed with the verdict." The air in the room felt heavy as the jury filed back into their seats. Avery's heart pounded in her chest. She had spent years calculating every move, every step, but now she was powerless. She had no control over what was about to happen. Her lawyer leaned toward her, whispering something about an appeal, but Avery barely heard him. The words echoed in her ears, but they were meaningless now. There would be no more tricks, no more manipulation. She had been caught, and there was no way out. The jury foreman stood and cleared his throat. Avery could feel the weight of the moment. She held her breath, waiting for the words that would seal her fate. "In the case of the people versus Avery Westbrook," the foreman said, his voice steady, "we find the defendant guilty." The word hit Avery like a punch to the gut. She staggered back, her legs giving way beneath her. The courtroom erupted in gasps. Her lawyer's hand gripped her arm, steadying her, but it felt like the world was spinning around her. Guilty. She had always been the one in control, the one who manipulated every situation. But now she was the one being judged. And it was final. The judge's voice cut through the chaos. "Miss Westbrook, you have been found guilty of multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and identity theft. Your actions have caused irreparable damage to countless individuals, including those who trusted you with their lives." Avery felt as if the walls of the courtroom were closing in on her. She had no way to fight back, no clever words to twist the truth. The room felt suffocating, and she could feel her pulse racing in her chest. She had always been able to talk her way out of everything, but not this time. This time, there was no escape. The judge continued, his words final. You are hereby sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Bail is revoked, and you will be remanded into custody immediately. The words seemed to echo in Avery's mind, repeating over and over. 15 years. 15 years in prison. The gavel slammed down, the sound loud and final, and Avery's world collapsed in on itself. Her lawyer, the same man who had once assured her she would walk free, looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and sympathy. But none of it mattered now. The sentence had been delivered, and there was no appeal, no last-minute escape. As the guards approached to take her into custody, Avery stumbled, her legs too weak to support her. She fought to maintain her composure, but the tears started to fall. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had always been in control. She had always found a way out. But not this time. She was escorted from the courtroom, her hands shackled, her heart racing. The whispers of the courtroom followed her as she walked through the doors, her mind spinning with thoughts of what lay ahead. But even as she was led away, she caught a glimpse of Emily sitting in the front row, her face a mixture of relief and quiet satisfaction. Avery had no words left. She had nothing to say to her sister now. The betrayal she had once inflicted on Emily had come full circle. As she was pushed into the holding cell, Avery sat down on the cold metal bench, her thoughts swirling. She had never felt so small, so powerless. In that moment, she realized that everything she had built, her wealth, her power, her influence, had been a house of cards. And now it was all crashing down around her. 15 years. That's what she had left. 15 years to reflect on the choices she had made, on the people she had destroyed. And no matter how hard she tried, Avery couldn't escape the one truth she had always avoided. Karma had finally caught up with her. Avery sat alone in her cell, her hands still trembling from the shock of the verdict. The reality of what had just happened was slowly sinking in, and she hated every second of it. 15 years in prison. The words echoed in her mind, relentless and unforgiving. She had spent her entire life manipulating, scheming, and outsmarting people, convinced that she was untouchable. But now, she was no different from the people she had once preyed upon. She was just another prisoner, a criminal. And nothing in her life had ever prepared her for this. The prison was nothing like the sleek, polished world Avery had known. The walls were gray and cold, the air thick with the scent of bleach and sweat. The constant hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a reminder of how far she had fallen. She had imagined prison would be like one of those TV dramas where she could use her charm and manipulate her way to the top. But here, in this place, there were no favors to be won with a pretty smile or a few well-placed words. She had nothing. No power, no connections, no leverage. She was just another inmate in a sea of forgotten souls, her once sterling reputation reduced to nothing. Avery squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to think of an escape, a plan, anything. But nothing came to her. For the first time in her life, she was truly powerless. As the days passed, Avery began to realize how much she had taken her previous life for granted. The luxury, the respect, the fear people had of her. It had all been a fragile illusion. Now, she was nothing. No one cared who she was. In here, there were no second chances, no way to manipulate the system. And worst of all, she was stuck in a place where she had to face the consequences of everything she had done. The other inmates weren't much better. In fact, they were downright hostile. Avery had always thought she could talk her way into any situation, charm people into doing her bidding. But here, no one cared about her smooth talk or her clever lies. People could see right through her. She wasn't powerful here. She wasn't feared. She was just another fraud in a sea of them. Avery had tried to make alliances just as she had in the past, but they all fell apart. No one trusted her. No one believed her when she said she could help them make money or get things they wanted. She was nothing to them. Worse, she was a joke. The other inmates would stare at her with cold eyes, as if she were a punchline to a joke they had all heard before. She had spent years controlling others, and now she was the one being controlled. Her first week in prison was a blur of humiliation. She had tried to reach out to a few women who seemed to run things, hoping they might take her under their wing. But they didn't. Instead, they shut her out. Avery learned quickly that in prison, your reputation didn't matter. You had to prove yourself, not with words, but with actions. And Avery didn't know how to act in this world. One afternoon in the prison cafeteria, she made a mistake. She tried to approach a group of women who were sitting together, talking and laughing as if they owned the place. Avery had always been good at reading people, at finding their weaknesses and exploiting them. She tried to use that skill now, slipping into the conversation with a casual comment about how she could make things happen, how she had connections on the outside. But it didn't go as planned. One of the women, a towering figure with a shaved head and tattoos running up her arms, leaned in close to Avery. Her eyes were cold, calculating. "You think we're stupid, don't you?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous. Avery blinked, taken aback by the sharpness of the question. "What do you mean?" she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You're just like the rest of them," the woman said, her lips curling into a sneer. "You think you can come in here and start running things with your pretty words? Well, you can't. You're nothing here, princess. No one's buying your act." Avery's stomach twisted. She had been confident, believing that she could use her old tricks to climb to the top of the prison hierarchy. But the truth was, in this world, no one cared about her past. Her charm, her manipulation, they meant nothing in this place. She had no leverage. No one feared her. No one respected her. The woman's words stung more than Avery wanted to admit. She had always believed that power came from control, from being able to manipulate others. But here, that didn't work. She was alone. And for the first time, Avery felt completely and utterly powerless. That night, as she lay on her thin mattress, staring up at the cracked ceiling, she realized just how far she had fallen. She had once believed that being feared was the same as being powerful. She had used people, destroyed lives, and walked away without a second thought. But now, in this cold, lonely cell, Avery understood something she had never truly grasped before. Being feared wasn't power, it was weakness. She had built her life on lies and manipulation, and now she was paying the price. The walls of her cell felt like they were closing in on her, but it wasn't just the walls of the prison. It was the walls she had built around herself. The arrogance, the pride, the belief that she was untouchable. Those were the things that had brought her here. Avery had spent her entire life running from the consequences of her actions, but now they had caught up with her, and there was nowhere to hide. Days turned into weeks, and Avery's situation didn't improve. She was still alone, still trying to figure out how to survive in a world that didn't care about her. The other inmates kept their distance, and she couldn't blame them. She had made enemies of everyone in her past, and now she was paying for it. But even as she struggled to find a way to survive, Avery knew one thing. She wasn't finished yet. She had been knocked down, but she wasn't going to stay down. She would find a way out. She always did. But this time, the game was different. There was no one left to manipulate, no one left to con. And as the days went by, Avery began to realize that the only person she could con now was herself. Avery had been in prison for over 3 months now, and the initial shock had worn off. The harsh realities of her new life were slowly becoming her routine. Each day was a repetition of the one before it. Waking up to the blaring sound of the morning bell, enduring the cold, sterile environment of the prison, and spending long hours in her cell, trying to escape into her thoughts. But no amount of daydreaming could erase the reality of what she had become. In the beginning, she had tried to maintain some semblance of her former self, the confident woman who had once run in elite circles, who had charmed her way into anything she wanted. She tried to be aloof, to keep her distance from the other women in the prison, to maintain the illusion that she was still untouchable. But the longer she stayed in the prison, the more she realized that the illusion was crumbling. The other women saw through her facade. They could tell that she wasn't as powerful as she had once thought. Her charm, her manipulative ways, they had no value here. She had nothing to offer in a world where survival depended on strength, respect, and, most of all, honesty. It was a brutal awakening for someone like Avery, who had spent her entire life perfecting the art of deception. But here, there was no room for deception. There was no room for anyone who didn't face the truth head-on. It took time, but Avery began to change. It didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't easy. There were moments when she felt like giving up, moments when the walls of her cell seemed to close in on her, and the loneliness threatened to swallow her whole. But then, something within her shifted. A small spark of realization ignited within her. She could stay the same. She could keep fighting the system, trying to manipulate her way out, but she had already lost. That path had led her here, to this dark, empty place where no one cared about her. Or she could choose to do something different. She could stop lying, stop pretending to be something she wasn't, and face the truth. Not just about the crimes she had committed, but about who she had become in the process. It wasn't easy. Avery's ego had been shattered. She had always relied on her ability to control and manipulate, but here, that was useless. Every day she faced the consequences of her actions, the broken relationships, the victims she had destroyed, but she knew that if she didn't change, she would be lost forever. In prison, Avery began to seek out the things she had never considered before, things like introspection, humility, and honesty. She started reading books. She took an interest in the prison's rehabilitation programs, even though, at first, she had written them off as pointless, but now she began to understand their value. One evening, she signed up for a group therapy session. At first, she thought it would be a waste of time. After all, she wasn't here because of some deep-seated trauma. She wasn't like the other women who had grown up in broken homes or had been victims of abuse. But as the sessions progressed, Avery began to see things differently. The women in the group shared their stories, stories of pain, regret, and lost opportunities. And as Avery listened, she realized that, despite her differences, she wasn't so different from them after all. They, too, had made mistakes. They, too, had been victims of their circumstances. And, like Avery, they had been given a chance to change. For the first time, Avery began to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time: empathy. She listened as women talked about their children, their families, their hopes for the future. She listened to their struggles, their vulnerabilities, and it made her feel something she hadn't expected. She had spent so much of her life focused on herself, on her own survival, that she had never truly considered the impact her actions had on others. One woman in particular, Rosa, a former drug dealer who had been convicted of assault, spoke about her own journey toward redemption. "We all make choices," Rosa said one day, her voice raw with emotion. "But it's what you do with those choices that matters. You can choose to let your past define you, or you can choose to change. No one's going to do it for you. You have to do it for yourself." Avery's heart clenched as she listened. She had always believed she was above the consequences of her actions, that she could escape with just a few well-timed words or a clever plan. But Rosa's words hit her hard. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. That night, Avery sat on her cot, staring at the cold concrete walls around her. For the first time, she began to truly understand the concept of accountability. She wasn't just here because of some unfortunate mistake. She was here because of the choices she had made. And while she couldn't change the past, she could choose to do better moving forward. It wasn't about getting out of prison early. It wasn't about manipulating the system. It was about changing herself. Avery didn't know exactly what that would look like. She didn't know what her future held, or if she would ever fully make amends for the pain she had caused. But she knew one thing. She wasn't the same person who had walked into that courtroom months ago. She wasn't the same woman who had smirked in the face of justice, thinking she was untouchable. And that, in itself, was a small victory. Months passed in a blur, and Avery's transformation, though slow, was undeniable. The woman who had once lived by deception, using her charm and cunning to manipulate everyone around her, was gradually fading away. The Avery Westbrook that had once walked into prison, arrogant, untouchable, and full of pride, was no more. In her place was someone else, someone trying to rebuild what had been broken, even if the pieces seemed irreparably scattered. Avery had started to focus on her rehabilitation. She enrolled in every program the prison offered, everything from anger management to job skills training. She started taking responsibility for the choices she had made, the lives she had ruined, and the people she had hurt. For the first time in her life, Avery wasn't trying to manipulate the system. She was trying to work within it. At night, she would sit in her cell, writing in her journal. Sometimes the words flowed easily, an outlet for all the emotions she had spent years burying deep inside her. Other nights, it was harder, as the reality of her situation would hit her all over again. 15 years in prison. 15 years to atone for the damage she had caused. 15 years to figure out who she was when all her carefully constructed layers of lies had been peeled away. One afternoon, Avery was in the prison yard, walking slowly around the track, when she spotted someone familiar standing by the gate. Her heart skipped a beat. Emily. She hadn't seen her sister since the trial. After that day, Emily had disappeared from Avery's life once again, leaving Avery to face the full consequences of her actions alone. But now, here she was, standing at the edge of the yard, watching Avery with a quiet intensity. Avery's stomach churned. She hadn't expected this. She had thought that after everything, Emily would be done with her, that she would never want to speak to her again. But Emily was here, and the look in her eyes was something Avery couldn't read. She stood still for a moment, torn between running and facing what was inevitable. Eventually, Emily walked toward her, her steps steady but slow. Avery couldn't move, her feet rooted to the ground. As Emily reached her, she stopped a few feet away, still holding Avery's gaze. You're here," Avery said, her voice sounding strange even to her own ears. It felt like an eternity had passed since she had spoken to Emily, and yet, now that her sister was standing before her, she didn't know what to say. Emily didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked Avery up and down, taking in the changes. The woman standing in front of her wasn't the same person who had walked away from her all those years ago. Avery's makeup was gone, replaced by the stark reality of prison life. Her once pristine clothes had been replaced with the standard orange jumpsuit. But more than that, Emily saw something in her sister's eyes. There was no arrogance there, no sense of superiority. Instead, there was something she hadn't seen before: regret. "I didn't think I'd ever see you like this," Emily finally said, her voice quiet, but the weight of her words hit Avery like a ton of bricks. Avery swallowed hard. "I never thought I'd be here either. I've had a lot of time to think. About everything. About what I did to you." For a moment, Emily didn't speak. She simply stood there, looking at her sister. Avery could see the conflict in her eyes. She had every right to hate her, to walk away, and never look back. Avery had stolen from her, abandoned her when she had needed her the most. She had destroyed everything Emily had worked for. And for years, Emily had carried the pain of that betrayal. But then, Emily took a step forward, closing the space between them. "I've spent years trying to figure out how I feel about you," she said, her voice steady. "I used to hate you. I used to wish you would pay for what you did to me." Avery felt the sting of those words, but they didn't shatter her like they might have once done. She deserved them. She knew it. She could see it in Emily's face, the scars that had been left by her actions. But something in her sister's expression had changed. There was no anger in Emily's eyes anymore, just something softer. Maybe it was forgiveness. Maybe it was just acceptance of what had happened. Avery couldn't tell. "I know," Avery said quietly. "I know I can't undo what I did. I know I can't take back the pain I caused. But I want to change, Emily. I have been changing. And I know it's too late to fix everything. But I'm sorry. I'm really sorry for what I did to you." Emily nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving Avery's. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. But then, Emily did something Avery didn't expect. She reached out, her hand hesitantly touching Avery's arm. "You're not the same person you were," Emily said, her voice low but sincere. "I can see that. But you've got a long way to go." Avery nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. I know I have a long way to go. I don't expect you to forgive me, Emily. I don't expect anything from you. But I just wanted you to know that I'm trying. I'm really trying." Emily's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long time, Avery saw something in her sister's expression, something that might have been hope. It wasn't full forgiveness, but it was a start. "I'm not sure I'll ever completely forgive you," Emily said after a moment, her voice calm. "But I can't just keep hating you either. That's not healthy for either of us. Maybe one day we can start over. Maybe." Avery's chest tightened at the possibility, even if it was just a small one. She had no illusions that her relationship with Emily would ever be the same, but hearing those words, hearing that there was a chance, even a small one, that things could get better, made something inside her stir. For the first time in a long time, Avery felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. "I'll take that," Avery said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll take that." Emily nodded once, then turned to leave. "I'll visit again sometime," she said over her shoulder. "But for now, You've got a lot of work to do. For yourself. Avery watched her sister walk away, feeling a sense of peace that she hadn't known in years. Emily was right. She had a lot of work to do. But she wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in years, Avery didn't feel completely lost. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. The weeks that followed Emily's visit were a turning point for Avery. There was no dramatic overnight change, no sudden epiphany that solved everything, but something had shifted inside her. The small seed of hope Emily had planted began to take root, slowly and steadily, in the hard soil of Avery's mind. For the first time since entering prison, she felt like there was a possibility of a future where she could atone for her past, where she could start over, even if it was from the bottom. Prison wasn't an easy place to change. The walls that surrounded Avery were thick, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. The women in her life, the ones who had made it through this harsh reality, were skeptical of her. They had every right to be. Avery had spent most of her life hurting others, making promises she couldn't keep. How could anyone trust her now? But slowly, Avery began to build relationships with the other women in the prison. At first, it was just small things, helping an inmate with her legal papers, offering support in group therapy, or lending a hand with chores. Avery didn't try to manipulate or control anyone anymore. She just listened. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel the need to have the spotlight on her, didn't feel the need to be the center of attention. She found peace in the quiet moments of self-reflection, in the simple act of being kind. She spent more time reading, absorbing everything she could about personal growth, responsibility, and empathy. She dug deep into her past, forcing herself to confront the people she had hurt, even if they were far away. Avery knew she couldn't undo what had been done, but she could try to be better from here on out. One afternoon, while working in the prison's library, Avery was approached by Rosa, the same woman who had shared her story of redemption months earlier. Avery had never been close to Rosa, but she had come to admire her strength. She had witnessed Rosa grow from a hard-edged survivor to someone who truly sought change. "You've been different lately," Rosa said, her voice soft but with an edge of curiosity. "I've noticed you've been helping out more, talking to people. I just wanted to say, good for you. It's not easy to change, especially in here." Avery turned to face her, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Thanks. It's been harder than I thought," she admitted, shrugging slightly. "But I'm trying. I have to try." Rosa leaned against the shelf, crossing her arms. "I know you've got a lot of baggage. We all do. But if you really want to make things right, you've got to stop running from it. Stop trying to control everything around you. You can't change the past, but you can change how you handle the present and the future." Avery nodded. Rosa's words echoed in her mind long after the conversation ended. It was true. She couldn't keep running from the person she had been. She had to face it head-on if she ever wanted to move forward. As weeks turned into months, Avery found herself slowly earning the respect of the other inmates, not through manipulation, but through her consistent efforts to change. Her past was still there, looming over her like a shadow, but she had started to carve out a new identity, one that was based on honesty, hard work, and the willingness to admit her faults. One day, as Avery sat in the prison yard, a letter arrived from Emily. Her heart skipped a beat as she tore open the envelope, already knowing what it was, a follow-up from her sister's visit. The letter was short, but the words were more than enough. "Dear Avery, I've been thinking about you a lot. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive you for what you did to me, but I see the changes you're making. I can't ignore that. I'm glad you're starting to face yourself. It won't be easy, but I hope you keep going. Maybe one day we can rebuild what we lost, but that'll depend on you. Keep working on yourself. I'm proud of the progress you've made. Love, Emily. Avery felt tears prickle at her eyes as she read the letter. Emily was proud of her. Despite everything she had done, despite all the pain she had caused, her sister still believed in her. Avery folded the letter carefully, pressing it to her chest as a wave of emotion flooded through her. She wasn't sure if she could ever truly make amends for what she had done to Emily. But she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer the woman who had left her behind. As she spent more time reflecting on the things that mattered most, Avery realized how much she had taken for granted before. She had always chased after money, power, and control, believing that those things would bring her happiness. But now, as she sat in her small prison cell, surrounded by the consequences of her actions, Avery saw the world differently. The relationships she had destroyed, the people she had hurt, couldn't be repaired with money or manipulation. They couldn't be fixed with the flick of a switch or a well-placed apology. The only thing she could do now was to be honest with herself, to continue the work of self-reflection and growth, and to prove to the world that she could change. Avery wasn't sure what her future would look like. Maybe it would be a life spent behind bars, doing the best she could to make up for the mistakes she had made. Or maybe, one day, she would walk out of prison a free woman, with the chance to rebuild her life outside. But whatever happened, she knew she had a long road ahead of her. There was no shortcut, no easy way out. But for the first time in years, Avery felt a strange sense of peace. She was no longer running from herself, no longer trying to escape the consequences of her actions. And that, Avery realized, was the first step toward freedom. Avery's days in prison had grown quieter, more focused. The initial urgency of survival had faded, replaced by a slower, more deliberate process of self-reflection and growth. The lessons she had learned in the first months about accountability, humility, and accepting the consequences of her actions had begun to settle into her bones, becoming part of who she was, even if she had a long way to go. She had started teaching classes in the prison's education program, using her skills to help other inmates prepare for their GED exams. The idea had initially seemed absurd. Avery, the woman who had once schemed her way through life, now teaching others. But as she stood in front of the small group of women, guiding them through math equations and reading comprehension exercises, she realized something that surprised her. She felt fulfilled. She wasn't manipulating anyone or deceiving them. She was truly helping them, guiding them toward something better. The feeling was foreign, but welcome. As Avery helped the women in her class, she began to realize that her own education, her own past decisions, had contributed to the life she had led. She had never taken the time to understand the value of hard work or education until it was too late. She had always believed she could buy her way to happiness. But now, standing in front of these women, she understood the power of knowledge. It wasn't about fancy suits or designer shoes. It was about learning, growing, and using what you had to improve yourself. Her relationship with the other inmates had also changed. She wasn't the outsider anymore, the untouchable woman who thought she could manipulate everyone around her. Avery had built real friendships, ones based on trust, hard work, and shared experiences. She no longer stood apart from the rest of the women. She was one of them. And while that realization came with its own challenges, it also came with a deep sense of belonging she had never known before. One afternoon, as she was cleaning the prison's common area, she was approached by Rosa again. This time, Rosa's smile was genuine, a small but significant acknowledgement of Avery's progress. "You've come a long way," Rosa said, leaning against the wall as Avery swept the floor. "You know, I wasn't sure at first. I thought you'd be just another one of those people who pretends to change. But you've stuck with it. You've actually done the work." Avery paused, the broom resting on the floor as she met Rosa's eyes. "I didn't know if I could," she said quietly. "But I can't keep pretending anymore. Not to myself. Not to anyone else." Rosa nodded, her expression softening. "That's the hardest part, isn't it? The pretending. It's easy to hide behind a mask. But eventually, you have to take it off. You've done that. I respect that." Avery felt a warmth spread through her chest. Respect. It was something she had never cared about before, something she had always tried to control through fear and manipulation. But now, it meant everything. It meant she was starting to earn back what she had lost. Later that day, as Avery sat alone in her cell, she reflected on everything that had happened since she first arrived at the prison. She had been so consumed with trying to escape, trying to run from her mistakes, that she had never truly stopped to face them head-on. But now, for the first time in years, she could look at herself in the mirror, figuratively at least, and feel something that resembled pride. It wasn't the kind of pride that came from conquering others or winning at all costs. It wasn't the pride of the woman who had once manipulated everyone around her. This was a quieter, more honest pride. It came from knowing that she was changing, that she was doing the work, and that, maybe, she could become the person she had always wanted to be. She wasn't perfect. She wasn't even close. But she was trying. And that, Avery thought, was enough. One day, as she was sitting in the library, reading one of the many books she had devoured in her time here, she saw a familiar face across the room. It was Emily. Avery's heart skipped in her chest as she stood up, unsure of what to expect. Emily had visited once since their initial encounter, but their relationship had remained distant. Avery didn't know if Emily would ever fully forgive her, and she didn't expect that to happen overnight. But seeing her sister again was a reminder of the work that lay ahead. Emily approached her slowly, her face unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Emily broke the silence. "How's everything going?" she asked, her voice neutral but not unkind. Avery took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "Better," she said quietly. "It's not easy, but it's better. I'm trying to do the work. I'm trying to be better." Emily nodded, her gaze softening just a fraction. "I can see that. I've been hearing some good things about you. It's not what I expected, but it's good." Avery swallowed hard. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I can forgive myself. But I'm doing my best. Every day." Emily's eyes lingered on her for a moment before she sighed, stepping closer. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive you completely, Avery," she said quietly, "but I can't keep holding on to the anger. It's not healthy for either of us." Avery's heart thudded in her chest. "I'm sorry. I know I can't make up for what I did, but I'm trying. I'm trying to make it right." Emily hesitated, then placed a hand on her sister's shoulder. "I'm not saying I'm ready to move on, but maybe we can start again. From here, from this point, we can both heal." Avery's breath caught in her throat, a lump forming as she fought to keep the tears at bay. The possibility of healing, of starting anew with Emily, was something she hadn't dared to hope for. But now, in this moment, it felt like a real chance. "Thank you," Avery whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for giving me that." Emily smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Just keep doing the work, Avery. Keep changing. That's all I'm asking. As Emily turned to leave, Avery stood still, watching her sister walk away. The path to redemption was long and uncertain, but for the first time, Avery felt like she had found her way forward. It wouldn't be easy, it wouldn't be quick, but it was a start, and that was all she needed. The days turned into months, and Avery found herself growing more and more comfortable in her new life. It wasn't the life she had imagined when she first entered prison. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't easy. But it was real. For the first time in her life, Avery was living authentically, not hiding behind lies or manipulation, but facing every truth head-on. Her relationship with the other inmates continued to improve. She had earned their respect, not through deceit, but through consistent effort, kindness, and a willingness to show up each day, ready to do the work. She taught GED classes with pride, always willing to lend a hand to those who struggled. Avery had stopped seeing herself as separate from the others. Instead, she viewed herself as part of a community where people didn't hide from their mistakes, but faced them and tried to be better. Still, there were moments when the weight of her past threatened to crush her. She had stolen, lied, and broken trust. The guilt didn't vanish overnight. Sometimes, the faces of her victims would appear in her mind: Sarah, Robert, the people she had left behind in her wake. And every time, she would remind herself that she couldn't change the past, but she could build a better future, one day at a time. As time passed, Avery began to take on more responsibility within the prison. She volunteered for various rehabilitation programs, including one for women with addiction problems. She listened to their stories, their struggles, and offered advice where she could. She realized that helping others was not only a way to give back, but it was also a way to help herself. She could see how far she had come, how much had changed since her first days in the prison, and she knew that every small step had added up to something meaningful. But despite all the changes she had made, there was one thing she had never been able to escape: the regret. She could never undo the harm she had caused, and that truth remained a constant companion. Avery had learned to live with it, to accept that some wounds couldn't be healed. But that didn't mean she would stop trying. Every act of kindness, every day she spent working toward becoming a better person, was part of her penance. Then one day, as Avery sat in the library, lost in a book about personal growth, she received an unexpected letter. She recognized the handwriting immediately: Emily. Her heart raced as she opened it, her fingers trembling. The letter was short, but its contents were enough to make Avery's world shift in a way she never thought possible. Dear Avery, I've been thinking about you a lot lately. I know things aren't perfect between us, and they never will be. But I see how hard you're working, and I see that you're trying to make things right. I want you to know that I'm proud of you, even if I don't always show it. I'm not asking for you to be perfect, and I don't expect you to undo everything you've done. But I'm willing to move forward. We can never go back, but maybe we can build something new. I think you've earned a chance at that. Love, Emily. Avery sat there for a long time, holding the letter to her chest. For the first time in a long time, her eyes filled with tears. But these were different. These were tears of relief, of hope. She had never expected Emily to forgive her fully. But this letter, it was everything she had needed. It was the first step toward healing, not just for Avery, but for both of them. In that moment, Avery understood something deeply. Redemption wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about doing the work, showing up, and making a genuine effort to change. Avery had learned that the hardest part of redemption wasn't just facing her past, it was facing her future with the courage to keep moving forward. Over the next few months, Avery and Emily kept in touch, exchanging letters, slowly rebuilding the bond they had once shared. It wasn't easy, and there were still painful moments, but the connection between them began to heal. Avery knew that their relationship would never be the same as it once was, but that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. They were both different people now, and they would find a new way forward. Eventually, Avery's time in prison came to an end. She had served her sentence, and she was ready to re-enter the world outside. As she packed her belongings and prepared to leave, she couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led her to this point. The woman who had once been driven by wealth and power, who had believed she was untouchable, had been replaced by someone more grounded, more aware of the world around her. Avery wasn't perfect. She wasn't free from the consequences of her past. But she was free to choose who she wanted to be from this point on. When she walked out of the prison gates, it wasn't with the same arrogance she had once carried. It was with a quiet sense of resolve. Avery knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready. She had learned that redemption wasn't a destination. It was a journey. And for the first time in her life, Avery was willing to take that journey step by step, without looking back. And as she looked up at the sky, she realized that no matter where the road took her, she was no longer afraid to face it. She was no longer the woman who had run from her mistakes. She was someone new, someone who had earned the chance to start again. It wasn't the ending she had expected, but it was the beginning of something better.